Hi, I'm Brandy,
And I'm Jen.
and this is
Keeping It Simple.
Hi, welcome to Keeping It Simple. This is episode 9, and in today's episode, we are talking about the symbolism of the sword.
Yes, we are. This is definitely an epic symbol. There's going to be a lot here that we're going to try to cover. It maybe have to go to 2 episodes at some point
Yeah.
because it's prolific as a symbol. But let's just start from, square one. So, Brandy, when you hear sword as a symbol, like what does that bring up for you? What are some of the just base points and keywords that you think of when you hear sword?
So for me, being a tarot reader, automatically you go to the thought processes, the intellect, discernment, discrimination, just the power of the intellect. But it's also a symbol of just common person. You're thinking of like protection, like what is a sword used for? So it's not
Right.
just the intellectual power; it's literally like the physical protection aspect. And you also have, because swords are made out of metal, it can depend on what that metal is, can give it an extra like quality, right? So like a sword that's made out of gold, which you might find in prehistoric, or not, I should say prehistoric times, but in certain eras, maybe different than what a prehistoric, knife is, right? And so when we think of sword, we can think of blades in general. Swords tend to be bigger, but just that blade in general, what does it mean? I mean, that's really it. You're talking about like the intellect, you're talking about protection, you're talking about power, and power in many different ways, not just physical power, not just intellectual power. You're talking about spiritual power, the
Yes.
ethers, the logos, the cosmos, like divine. And then you're, of course, everything that comes with that, which is leadership, hierarchy, whatever that may be.
Yes, definitely. But yes, yes to all that. and
It's a
since you
lot.
and since you mentioned what metals a sword is made of can affect the symbolism, let's just go straight to the oldest history we can find,
Okay.
because the oldest swords that at least in my research, that have ever been discovered, that date around to 3300 BC, are the Arslanterp swords found in modern day Eastern Turkey. And
That makes sense.
what's that? Oh, that
That
makes
makes sense. Yeah, that
Mhm.
makes sense.
These predate the Bronze Age and the production of bronze, and so interestingly, they're made of a copper alloy. And I know there's you know this stuff better than I do. That's why I was like, I want to see what Brandy says about this, because I know copper is definitely a big one in alchemy, if I'm not
It
mistaken.
is.
So if,
Yes.
if you would just touch on that, because I wanted to know like what significance, like significantly, symbolically, and spiritually does that have?
So this is kind of a mixture of the alchemical process, and then it's also just like me,
Yeah,
myself, Brady.
yeah.
So copper is Venusian, Venus, right? And it's associated on the tree of life with the seventh Sephiroth, which is Netzach. And so you're talking about victory. And so when you talk about copper, it is a very, like for me personally, it's a very, again, that Venusian, that female, that fertile, but at the same time, when we think of, it's a beautiful metal, right? Like whether
Yeah,
it's aged
yeah.
copper or it's new polished. So it's
Mhm.
very much that, it's interesting that it's copper being associated with victory,
Uh-huh.
and that aspect of like what is that in your alchemical process. If you know the tree of life, if you're at the seventh Sephiroth, then you've already descended down to the seven. So now you're going, you've only got a few more places before you're in the physical manifest. And so 7 and 8 tend to play Netzach and Hod, which are two opposing aspects on the tree of life. They actually kind of work together. And so it's very much, when you think of alchemy, it's kind of like one piece of the puzzle, like that starting initiative, like that where are you going? It's coming out of that in
Uh-huh.
order to bring it down. It's taking something before it's given the intellectual property of that physical force. Does that make sense? The way
It
I'm
does.
explaining it.
It does. Yeah.
But again,
Interesting.
it's very Venusian.
Mhm.
It's the feminine principle, which is interesting because of the pillar that it's on, but that's
Mhm.
I don't want to go like too down rabbit holes
Right.
here because
Yeah.
but it's very interesting because I associate so much with Netsock on just a personal level and things in my life that I attribute to it. And I absolutely love copper. I have tons of copper actually. I have tons of antique brass, but I actually have tons of copper pots and stuff like that. Antique copper pots, which I absolutely love. And I love for them to be planters
Uh-huh.
because they are a wonderful, first of all, conductor of energy. So
Yes.
copper is an amazing conductor of energy. If you ever see me in person, I know you may not have seen my funky sandals, but I wear these sandals. They're called Earth Runners is the
I
brand.
think you've shown
And
them to me maybe. They're real
yeah,
flat,
and
aren't
so
they?
they're completely flat, and so because the principle is that you were pulling the magnetic frequency off of the surface of the planet, and you're running that through basically the bottom of your feet. And the way that these shoes are made, these sandals, we're actually not meant to wear. We're supposed to have zero drop shoes, so you're not supposed to have any arch support. You're not supposed to have any of those things. It's not normal for your feet. It's not normal for heels, and it's not normal for arch support.
Right.
It's not good for your feet either. And so these shoes are intended to be almost like you're walking barefoot. And the way that they do it, because you do have a sole, which creates a barrier between your foot and the magnetic resonance of the planet's surface. They have a copper plug in them, and then that copper wire actually runs through the laces that go around the top of your foot. And it's shown to, it's called earthing,
Yeah.
but they've actually done tons of research that shows that the copper will actually conduct the magnetic resonance of the planet into your feet, which can help with circadian rhythm, inflammation, arthritis,
Dang.
fibromyalgia, all kinds of autoimmune
Yeah.
disorders, stuff like that. So copper in general
Uh-huh.
is not only associated with Netsock on the Tree of Life and this Venusian, creative energy power, which, sorry, Francis is trying to join us again because
Hi,
I forgot to shut
Francis.
the door. This is Francis.
Hi, kitty.
He's my copper kitty.
Yeah, copper kitty. He just knows it's his time to
My copper
shine.
kitty. I know. He's like, let's go, mom. So it is a conductor of energy, and that's why you have these metals association, but it's very much it's what you do with it, right? Like it's going to pick up
Yeah.
the energy anyways, but you have the power to direct it. Where are you directing it? What are you doing with it? So copper is wonderful. It's also highly toxic to hold in your hand. So make
Yes.
sure to wash your hands afterwards. That's why they say, particularly the older pennies, I think it's pre 1940 when they were purely copper. I think it was 1940 and
Right.
1942, somewhere in there. Um, so yeah, you don't want to just come into or contact with copper raw in its own. If you do, make sure to wash your hands afterwards and don't
Definitely.
handle it for long. But from an alchemical process, that's what you're talking about. You're talking about
Yeah.
there's way more. And I hope we do an episode on metals because I
Yeah.
think it would be phenomenal to do an episode on copper. Maybe we'll
Yes.
do that next month. But
Yeah.
that's kind of a general, very, very minute scratching of the surface on copper.
But half of what you said could easily be attributed to the symbolism of sword energy, because you're talking about it being a conductor and it's directing, how do you want to direct that energy? I mean, if you think about the holding a sword, it's an extension of you. It's an extension of your power. So I think that all to me like was sending off little bells of like, oh my gosh, that all just makes sense for the sword as well. Because you think about the sword also being in the magician card in tarot, and it's one of the tools of the magician because you're directing your will, directing your power, directing your energy.
So interestingly, sorry, this is just adamant. He knows. He's like, Mom is talking. Interestingly, now the sword in the tarot well, there are Hebrew attributes that have been assigned to the tarot cards. Okay. One of those Hebrew attributes is literally the sword,
Okay.
Zayin, which is associated with the lover's card. There's different associations depending on different traditions. And the tradition that I follow is associated with card number 6 because it is numerically number 7, which is interesting because we were just
You
talking
were just
about
talking about the
7
tree of life. Yes.
being Netzach.
Yes.
And so Zayin is literally the sword. Now, when it comes to this, I made some key points because if I don't make key points, we're going to go off on 5 different rabbit holes. I'm telling you right now. So here's some main points when we talk about, the sword association, particularly as it relates to kind of what we were talking about already in Netzach, the seventh Sephiroth of the Tree of Life. But Zayin itself is the mental sword. It cuts away the irrelevant for deeper understanding, which is
Yes.
interesting. Last year, we were in a numerological 6 year, which would
Mhm.
have been the lovers and Zayin. However, we're in a 7 year right
Right.
now, which is the Hebrew numerical value of Zayin. So a lot of us are experiencing the symbolism of the sword this year. We're
Ooh,
experiencing things being cut away out of our life for
yes.
deeper understanding and deeper meanings, which
Swiftly
is
cut
very
out
interesting.
too. Swift.
Yes. And that's the thing. And so it's talking about, in Zayin, it's literally like teaching you like your own approach to the divine. Like,
Yeah.
how do you cut away these things that are not, how many times do we do or say things because you were taught you must say the Lord's Prayer, or you must do this, or you must do that? But that doesn't necessarily give you more of a connection to an authentic connection to divine. So
Right.
when we think about the sword, it's literally not just cutting away the things in our life that are, we're looking for deeper meaning, but specifically as it relates to like spiritual, divine, like how do you get closer to God? And so it's talking about, with Zayn, it's really this increased ability to absorb and digest spiritual ideas by the removal of things that are not significant. So you think
Yeah.
about like for meat eaters, a lot of people will trim away the fat because it's not necessary. A lot
Yes.
of people won't. So it's kind of literally like thinking of that sword that's trimming away the fat to get to the real
Yeah.
meat of something.
Cutting to the heart of the situation, cutting out what
Yeah.
doesn't serve
Yeah.
you. Yeah. Love that.
And so, I mean, it's the big thing with Zayn that here's my last point. I'm telling you, I had to make key points because I was like, if I don't, we're gonna go. Um, but it's talking about, major changes that are gonna occur in your life if you make good use of the sword.
That's the key.
If,
Yeah.
if and only if, because it is considered a spiritual tool.
Right.
And when you talk about copper and alchemy, it also translates not just to copper, but in that sword period, it's that purifying fire that the flaming sword, right? And it's talking about, being able to use that, cutting away that discrimination, and also sacrifice in the name of clarity,
Yes.
self-sacrifice in the name of something of service, something bigger than you, the getting to the heart of it, getting to the meat of it. So
Love that. Wow. Dang, this one's off to a deep start. Love it.
oh, and here's one that I also, before I forget, because I'm telling you, key points, man. I knew this one, I was like, man, I got too much to say on this one. Um, it's interesting. I know we've talked about grapes and we talked about Adam and Eve. So you know that they were booted from the Garden of Eden, right?
Right.
And so when Eve cried, her drops turned into lilies, that she supposedly consumed grapes was the forbidden fruit, not the apple. Now, the angels who escorted Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden had flaming swords, and they threw lightning that became a boundary like a wall of fire,
Yep.
preventing them from returning. And that was in Genesis 3:24.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, as a segue, which I know we're going to talk about Vishnu, but Vishnu had a flaming sword that had pure knowledge and destruction of ignorance. So we saw
Ooh.
that same flaming sword
Yeah.
in the stories of Vishnu that we see in Adam and Eve.
And
We
often
might also
that flaming sword is usually modern times attributed to Archangel Michael, even though
correct.
biblically it doesn't actually ever credit him with having a flaming sword. Artistically, the art, everything kind
He's
of
seen with
started
it.
picking up that he was the figure that wielded that flaming sword.
Now I want you to think about that for a second. In our modern interpretation, what does Archangel Michael do? What does he do?
He is the ultimate protector, guardian. He cuts down Satan, he cuts down evil. He's kind of like the big baddie, like leader of all the forces.
Okay.
Yep. Warrior,
So I
warrior
have
angel.
my Archangel Michael statue up here that was given to me by my law enforcement mom, because he's the patron saint of law enforcement. Now, he's the big bad protector, right? And we're talking about Vishnu, which I'm sure we're going to go into, in his flaming sword of pure knowledge and destruction of ignorance. So we got protector, we've got this pure knowledge, we've got the Garden of Eden, these angels with their flaming swords escorting them and creating this wall of fire. Now, I know you like your modern day interpretations and all of that. Is there anything that you can think of in modern day cinema that has flaming swords that are protectors? They are protection of the knowledge. They are the destruction of ignorance.
Oh my gosh, you put me on the spot with these trivia questions. It sounds like so right there. I'm like,
As
I
soon
can
as I was
almost
writing
picture
it, this
it.
thing
I can
this
almost
thing
picture
came to
it.
my mind. I mean, I was just writing out my notes and I'm thinking, God, I don't even need to research on this one. I know too much. It's ridiculous. And then I thought, my God, that reminds me of that.
Oh, just tell me, because I'm drawing a blank and I know I'm gonna hate myself as soon as you tell me, because I'm gonna be like, oh, that's it. What is it? What is it?
Jedi Knights and their lightsabers.
Oh my gosh, yes. And my
Isn't that cool?
child is running around with all these homemade lightsabers lately. So that's all I hear about is the different properties of
It's
different
like
and
a
the different
flaming
colors. And
sword.
yes, the flaming sword.
Right?
Love
I mean,
that.
it's not a
Yes.
sword, but it's flaming and it has, again, that destructive and purifying property to it.
Well, and it
And
has the mystical energies associated, because to be a
yes,
Jedi, you're not just wielding a weapon, you're wielding a weapon that also you have your mystical properties of your
that
mind
intellectual, all of
and
it.
being able to
Yeah.
control. Yes. Ah, ooh, I love it.
Isn't that cool? And again,
Yes.
it's the type of what type of, who's wielding that sword, who's
Right.
wielding that, lightsaber. Oh girl, man, Star Wars. My house, Christmas
Yeah.
time, I got Star Wars blow ups. That's my house.
I love
I'm
it.
that
Love it.
house.
That's a
Oh,
good house. I love that.
that is, but so just talking about again that flaming sword, right? Like it's that separation of man and the divine, the higher, the lower, the intellect, and what are you doing with it? How are you wielding it?
Yes.
That power, because that's really what it is. But it is that cutting away, that discernment. How do you get closer to the meat, the true essence of things?
Yes. Cut through the bullshit, if we can say
Well,
that.
yeah, you can. And I mean, and if you think about it, like a sword has two edges.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's most
Double-edged
swords have
sword.
two, yeah,
Yep.
double-edged sword. And we hear those sayings all the time, like it's a double-edged sword. You get this, but you also get this. And so it's also stepping not just into the cutting away, not just into the intellect, but it can literally be a this or that, or if you do this, you get this also. Does that make
Yes.
sense?
Yes. Yeah. I
So
love
I mean,
that.
it's kind of that dual nature, even in us. I mean, we just talked about this with the fox,
Yeah.
when we did the
Duality.
fox episodes, that duality, you get one and the other, the light and the dark. So being able to maneuver between, swords can, you can use a sword. I wouldn't recommend using a sword, but you could use a sword, a blade, to cut down a tree,
Sure.
to create a fire, to cook your food on, right? So it has that destructive property, but it created something out of that destruction.
Yes.
So it's kind of that, it depends. Archangel Michael, who are they battling, and what destruction comes, but what comes after that destruction. So again, it's
Yes.
that twofold nature.
Yes. I also love the directness of a sword, because there's, if you want to get, I don't want to get too macabre as far as talking about killing and stuff, but if you want to get really down to what a sword does, and it protects, it's a weapon, you can't, you have to be in close contact with somebody to stab or to slice or to cut. There's not going to be any question about who did the slicing or stabbing or cutting. It's not a matter of like a
Yeah.
gunshot from far away. It's not a matter of a poisoning where you're not sure. I mean, forensically, with your law background,
Yeah,
like
forensic.
it's a lot more in that intimate moment. It's
It's
a lot more
intimate.
cut and dry. It's very direct. It's a very direct type of action that a sword takes and makes.
Well, and there are certain cultures in the world where, they still, it's hand-to-hand combat, and
Yes.
we'll use swords. Like that's the honorable thing to do. And if
Right.
you use any other means, that's dishonorable, and it goes back to that same thing. It's interesting because you were talking about, that close contact and the importance of the sword. So when you look at all these different cultures and the way that they view swords, it's not always just the intellect, right? Like it can
Right.
be physical stuff too. Because I mean, like for instance, just a base off, right? A two-sidedness. Here's your two-sided blade. You know, the Buddhists view it as discrimination, which cuts away ignorance at the roots. Very much like Vishnu,
Right.
very much like your Jedi Knights, very much like, you know, your angels and Genesis. It's that creating a boundary, it's cutting away and getting rid of.
And
Um,
cutting to truth
Yes,
and a
yeah,
pure
exactly,
truth.
and the same thing as your Zayn, right? But at the same hand, you know, while you have that, here's a kind of a middle ground of that. In Islam, it is seen as, you know, a holy war between and against the infidel and the man against his own evil. So
Mhm.
you've got that ignorance to now we're talking about the infidels and evil. And then you have others who are on the flip side where it's like, no, it's in Japan, it's courage, it's strength. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But at the
Yeah.
same hand, it's kind of like it has the same job,
Right.
streamline of meaning. So I find that to me, that's fascinating how you get some people who are, again, it's like the two-sided blade. Do they see it as strength and courage, or do they see it more of a destructive power with this ability to, you know, cut away and do away with?
Right. That's really
So
interesting.
it's
Yeah. Yeah, there's quite a few legendary swords too, and you
that's
know,
what I
and
was about to say, because there's some, yeah, there's some definite legendaries here.
yeah, there's a couple different legendary swords that to me tie back to sense of worth too, where swords can almost represent that you're worthy of wielding this sword. It's not even just about do you have the courage, but are you worthy? So we see Excalibur. Most people are familiar with Excalibur and that famous story of King Arthur pulling the sword from the stone, where nobody else could get it wedged from the stone, and that meant he was worthy to wield this magical sword. And then there's one from Norse mythology too. Are you familiar with that one? From the
Yes.
Volsunga saga. In Icelandic lore, there's a warrior that was named Sigmund, and at his wedding, Odin appeared, the great god Odin in Norse mythology, and he thrust a sword named Gramur into a tree. He declared at the wedding that anybody who could remove the blade would find no better weapon in his days. And that was also kind of suggesting, similar to that Excalibur, King Arthur mythologies, are very similar. Like whoever can pull this out is worthy of having this amazing magical mystical weapon. And so Sigmund, the great warrior, was the one who pulled it out, and he was some people suggested that he should part with it, and he refused to. He's like, this is mine. Just earned this. And it was a gift from Odin. So there you go. But again, that worth, that sense of like you're worthy to wield this blade.
Well, and I mean, just if you think of in general with Scandinavia, you know, their swords, literally, people should go look at the swords from these times that have been recovered, and they actually find them in graves quite a bit, and
Right.
they're pretty well intact, or they can reconstruct them digitally to determine like kind of how it was based off. These were ornate. These
Hmm.
weren't just, you know, a basic sword. Like they treated their swords had names, they had powers, not just Excalibur, right? But in Scandinavia, it was not uncommon for their swords to have names,
Hmm.
to be imbued with some special power that the, you know, wielder would tap into. And I mean, we're talking like jewel encrusted, precious metals, that sort of thing, because it was an honor. It was to be able to wield this, you were chosen just as much as you chose the sword, as you designed the sword or had it. Do you know what I'm saying? Like it was a
Right.
almost like a personal amulet, but it's not really an amulet. Does that make sense?
It
Like the way I'm
does.
saying it, like it was a
Yeah.
very personable item, and they were buried with their swords a lot of times. That's why we'll find these burials, and it's like these incredible swords that they have.
Right.
Now, do you know, I like the Tuatha De Danann. Um, so this is Celtic, and it's talking about the hero King Nuada, which is the head king of the Tuatha De Danann. Do you know who that is? We've talked about this kind of
Aren't
briefly.
they kind of a race of mystical beings that are kind of
Yes.
half human, half, yeah.
Yes, yes. We're talking about ancient aliens again here,
Yes.
folks. But again, they
Ancient
were very
aliens.
tall, they're red hair, they're blue green eyes. Anyways, So we're going back to Ireland, right? The Tuatha De Danann. King Nuada, which was the head, was a, you know, the sword was seen as having these supernatural powers, and to wield it was literally like the active aspect of your will. To wield is your
Yes.
will. And so it wasn't just a battle item. It was literally kind of like what a wand would be when we think of, like Harry Potter or what else, like directing
Directing
your
your will.
will.
Hmm.
Yeah. So swords are not just about combat. They're not just about, something beautiful and shiny to put on your hip and, walk around looking bad about. They're literally a means to direct your intentions and your will towards something. It is a
Definitely.
magical item, which is,
Yes.
that's why you see a lot of magical practitioners that use, some of them use swords, I'm sure,
Hmm.
but they will have some sort of blade and they will call it by some sort of name, depending on the tradition that they follow. It is a literal representation of the will, directing the
Right.
will into the outside, outside of you.
I also think to the fact that just making a sword in like blacksmithery,
Oh
it
God, yeah.
requires all four elements. And if you think
Yep.
about how a magician works with the elements, all four elements in harmony. So, it's not just about being, forged in the fire. There is the fire aspect, but it
Yeah.
has to be cooled in the water.
Water.
It
Yeah.
has to have the bellows, has to make the air, the bellows for the air to make the fire. And then the metals from the earth itself. So it's really fascinating when you think about a sword comes from all four elements in the way it's forged.
Well, and tempering a blade is an alchemical process in and of itself, and that is revered in many, many cultures throughout the world, modern day, all the way to recorded history,
Hmm.
because you're talking about that very thing. It's the ability to marry fire and water.
Yes.
Yes, you have the
Yeah.
air and the earth aspect of it, but it is you have to have the perfect alchemical marriage between fire and water for tempering a blade to act correctly, or you can break a blade. You're going to split
Yes.
it.
Yeah.
And so it is literally a master craftsman, in alchemy, which is, if you think about the work of a magician is to perfect his mind, to perfect his craft, to overcome. And part of that is patience
Hmm.
and perfection of the work. And that's what happens with these blacksmiths and these people that are tempering these blades. Like, you have to have patience, you have to have perfection. And if you get antsy, if you do any of those things, you'll break your blade.
Right.
It's, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Here I am talking like I know what the hell I'm talking about. But I do. I mean, I get that I've never done it, but
Yeah.
I mean, I know enough about it that's one thing that I've always wanted to learn.
Hmm.
Actually, that's one thing I've always thought would be really cool, is to learn blacksmithing. And then at the
Yeah.
same time, I'm like, I have not perfected that side of myself yet. I do not have that patience yet. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not quite there. Yeah. Which again goes to that mental side. In order to have the physical blade, you have to maintain or gain control of the intellectual side. Like, you
Right.
have to have the maintain and complete control of how you are mentally responding to something.
Definitely. Word.
So, word to your mother. There was another one that was in, now this is interesting. That I came across because I started going down King Nuada and the Tuatha De Danann, and then I went through 5 other rabbit holes of stuff. Now, this one I did not think about. I've heard it before, but I had not put it into context. It kind of showed up like how Star Wars and the Jedi Knights did. I was reading about, there's the Norse mythology, you've probably heard this one, and it talks about at the gate of heaven, there is a man juggling 7 swords for one of each of the 7 spirits of planetary spheres. At the gates of heaven,
Hmm.
there is a man juggling 7 swords, each sword representing one of the 7 planets. What does that remind you of in tarot? Who's juggling 7 swords?
Oh, the Seven of Swords.
Yeah. Isn't that fascinating?
Yes, yes.
So,
Interesting.
I mean, I've heard that there was at the gates of heaven, there's 7, the juggler
Uh-huh.
of 7 swords, and that
Right.
7 is a very holy number. Different, regions have different meanings and stuff behind it, but it often is attributed to the 7 heavenly bodies. And so you start thinking about it, and I thought, as soon as I read that, I was like, I have heard this before and never once thought about the juggler of the seven swords.
Yeah, and juggler is such an interesting word because that in that figure, the way it's depicted, it is very much like, this kind of
Yes. And it
whimsical
makes
way that
you,
they're carrying these swords.
yeah, and it makes you wonder. I'm sure that's probably where Pixie got it from or some
Yeah,
sort of inspiration from,
sure.
but it makes you wonder. Then I started thinking about, okay, so if the swords are the intellect, and we know the seven of swords is very much about, maybe taking what resonates with you and leaving the rest, knowing when to put something down because it's too much to handle,
Right.
what is a right now versus a maybe later, what's worthy, again, that discrimination, that discernment, having that insight and intellect and the ability to make better judgments, leaving behind, cutting away. So
Hmm.
then it makes you think, well, what are those two things left behind? Like, what are those, if those are attributed in this story to each of those swords being one of the seven spirits of planetary spheres, that means two things have been left behind. And then that's a very personal question, because then that's questioning your intellect. If I'm going to leave something behind, y'all can have let's see, you can take Neptune, you can take Pluto, go ahead and take Mars and Saturn with you.
Poor
Like, I'll be
Pluto.
leaving, I know.
Poor Pluto
And I
can't
mean,
catch a
well, Pluto's not
break.
one of the predominant, but I mean, I'm literally thinking to myself, like, you can have restrictive Saturn and you can have Mars, because I'm
Right.
about done with those two. But
Right.
again, that comes from the context of what pressure is being put on me that is intellectually impacting me and making me cut things out of my life to get to higher
Yes.
truths. So
Yeah.
you can ask yourself those questions. Where am I having pressure put on me?
Right.
What do I need to cut away? Now, if that's pressure, maybe for you, that could be something different. Maybe for somebody else, that's like, I'm done with Mercury. I can't get out of my head. I can't get past whatever. So maybe I'm in the Seven of Swords, leaving behind the planet Mercury. I'm cutting that away. I'm cutting away the stinking thinking. I'm cutting away the thinking that's not in alignment with divine truths or whatever that may be. So I will tell you right now, I will never look at the Seven of Swords the same again.
Oh my gosh, me either.
So that's, I
Crazy.
mean, that's literally a what are you being called to cut away
Yeah.
and let go of? I mean, that's a new way of looking. That's not just not planning well. That's not just deception or thievery or a fox in your hen house.
Right.
That's a whole new way to look at Seven of Swords.
Yes, it is.
What
Woo.
is spiritually being cut away? What are the two things you're being asked to walk away from?
Yeah. I love that interpretation. God, you're right.
Much.
Next time I pull that card, it's gonna be like, whoa.
So I mean, it's so here's the other side of it that I started messing with. Now in the tarot, the swords and the wands are masculine principles, right? They are
Yes.
active, and the
Yes.
cups and the pentacles are receptive and they're passive. Here's what I find interesting. So when you look at the swords cards, your king of swords, your queen of swords, your knight of swords, it's all on the right hand, which makes sense because the right side of the body is attributed to the masculine side, the
Right.
left is to the feminine. So that makes sense, right? Even in Justice, who is said to be a lady, technically,
Mm-hmm.
the sword is in the right hand. So again, it's that authority, that leadership. Because when we think of masculine, we're not talking about gender identity here. We're talking about the principles of masculine versus feminine, active versus
Right.
receptive, right? And so it's very much like a forceful out into the world, like taking the dominion, the leadership, the intellect that I see clearly. Now, this is something I had not noticed before. um, the Page of Swords, he's holding it with both hands. So there is an actual balancing between the masculine and the feminine. It's almost like the decision hasn't been made yet. And since
Interesting.
the pages of sword, or the pages in
Oh.
general, right? Those are your initiates, your neophytes. And so it's literally, when you think about the sword being that intellect, that divine inspiration, the learning, the what's being cut away, whatever you want to talk about, and the many things that we've just talked about. When you have it in the page of swords, it's almost like it's there, you're being initiated, but you don't have enough to act yet. You haven't earned the right to wield it yet.
Yeah. Woo.
So I
Dang.
like that.
Yeah.
So I will never look at, I mean, that's kind of the attributes that I assigned to Page of Swords. But when I sat back and thought about it, it was like, that's often something that I tell people when I will see it in a reading is you've got new information coming in. You're not really going to have enough to act on it. Don't act on it yet. It's not telling you to act. It's telling you to be receptive of,
Right.
to, whatever, write down what your inspirations are. So when I thought about that, when I saw it, I was like, it makes sense why it's in both hands, because it isn't an active principle yet. It
Yeah.
is literally sitting in that middle ground of reception, but not active yet.
Never going to look at that card the same either.
Never again.
Never again. Oh, that's
Do you have
exciting.
any tarot inspirations or anything other fabulous attributes of the sword?
No, I don't really have any tarot, but as you know, I am a martial arts instructor. So,
Yeah.
I got to talk about samurai swords.
Oh,
I got
I
to.
knew that was coming.
And if this wasn't strictly more of a podcast, I could whip out my sword collection because I got some swords. I have a beautiful samurai sword that I got at a Scottish festival.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know, but it's beautifully made. It's very beautifully crafted. So in the samurai tradition, swords are literally they're an extension of the soul. So I know we're talking a lot about the extension of your will, the extension, but for them, it's literally a part and extension of your soul, your sword. I don't know for sure if they had burials with their swords, but they very likely did because it's that same kind of concept where it was a very dear sacred object for them. And they're also considered, samurai swords in general are considered to be some of the finest made swords ever, historically, ever in any time period. But they are more curved. So when we were talking about that double-edged sword, the samurai sword actually does have more of a blade edge. It's not double-sided like your standard, maybe European old swords. I do have here, I'll just show for anybody on the YouTube. So like here's my boken, which is a training sword, and you can see it kind of has that curve. And so the curved edge, that kind of curves, it would be the edge where there'd be sharpness, and this part would be not as sharp, would not cut you. One of the things I love is training and martial arts. We always use the term blade aware. And so obviously that is just, the boken is just almost a toy. It's wood, because we don't train when we're learning a sword. We don't train with like the actual metal sword because there's little kids using these things. We don't want anybody getting cut up.
Yeah.
So you have to learn first. But when you're learning, even though that wood is not going to cut you, you're still taught to be blade aware from the very first moment. And that kind of means, and I will admit, there were times where I would literally, when I was first learning the sword, the samurai sword, that main size sword is called a katana. I would actually have a little itch, scratch my head with it. I would maybe grab it by the sword because, when you're just using the wood one, it's really easy to be like, well, it's not actually going to cut me. But we would get in trouble really quickly from our master instructor. It's like, no, be blade aware. And I just like that as an analogy for all this sword talk, because it's kind of like how being aware of where you're pointing your weapon, where you're directing it, all that thing, those things we're already talking about conceptually can be seen in the training of actually learning a sword as well, especially in the samurai traditions, being blade aware.
Well, and it's interesting because you're talking about, what did you call that again? The wooden sword?
So the wooden one is called a boken. That's the name for it's almost like a toy sword, which they are usually given one as a small child. And more in ancient times, they were literally given a boken from the time they were a child, and they would start learning it from childhood. And so that was their toy sword that they would start learning with before they could wield the real thing.
So in Hinduism, they have the wooden sword of the Vedic as well. And it's talking about sacrifice. And so it's interesting because they also talk about it symbolizing lightning, like the lightning flash of inspiration, which takes you to the tower. But they use the wooden swords as well, which I did not know of. That's something that I came across. And I was like, that's pretty interesting, because that's not something I would see often that I would think of attributed to Hinduism.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying? Or that region of the world. So that was very interesting to me. Now, you talking about, do you have anything else on martial arts? Because I have one that I was going to bring up if we have time, because it deals with that lightning flash and the descent and manifestation.
The only little bit I'll throw out is, interestingly, they were carried on the left side of the body with the blade pointing upwards. That's how they would standardly carry their weapons, their sword.
With the blade pointing upwards, backwards?
Yep. That's what my research said. The left side, I just were thinking we were talking about the left versus the right side of
Yeah.
the body. So I
Well,
thought that was interesting.
I'm wondering though, if that's because you would pull with your right. That would make sense
Yes,
on why it's
possibly. That
on
might
the
make sense.
left.
Yes.
Like if it's on the left because you're pulling with your right, so that would make sense. I just find it very interesting that the blade would be up. But then yet
Right.
again, if we're talking about blades being a direct link, or what have you, from
Conduit.
divine
Mhm.
inspiration, yeah, the conduit.
Mhm.
I mean, it makes sense that the blade would actually be pointing upwards because it's drawing down. It's the same thing you're seeing in the magician. He's drawing down the power.
Yes.
He is the conduit, he is the wand, he is the sword.
Yeah, I'll have to dig a little. I'll
So
have to go down that rabbit hole. I'm curious if that's the reason, because definitely their swords were very symbolic and sacred. So there very well is a reason for it pointing upwards because of something symbolic like that with the
yeah, I
heavens.
already feel we're gonna have to do a second episode on
Oh
this because
yes.
there's so much.
Oh
So
yes.
this one kind of goes with, this is in that same, again, that same like intellectual divine inspiration sort of thing, right? Like it's an extension of the soul, if you will, like you were talking about.
Right.
So in Christianity, swords are seen as Christ's passion and his martyrdom. And so this is where I've kind of seen it, but I haven't really like dug into it. And I was like, okay, that doesn't make sense. I mean, there's a lot of things I've seen attributed to him that we've already talked about.
Yeah.
This is not one. That I was like, you know what? I'm going to dig into this. I want to see. So there is said to be a flaming sword at each gate or corner that divides man from paradise and heaven. That's interesting to me. We've already talked about it's associated with Archangel Michael. It's also associated with Saint Barbara, which I'm sure you probably know. I actually have, you might even too, when we went and saw the art exhibit in Dallas, the Flemish artwork, and we saw that statue of Barbara.
Uh-huh.
Now Barbara, Saint Barbara, is associated with the tower. Okay.
Okay, I didn't
I
know
don't know if you
that.
know that. Yes. So she's associated with the flaming tower.
Okay.
And in the tower card, we have the lightning flash striking
Mhm.
off the crown of the king, the martyrdom of Jesus Christ in the tower card. So there's a lot of symbolism all in this right here that I started going boom, boom, boom. The sword is also associated with Paul and Peter. So I'm
Okay.
telling you, like I kind of started writing it and then I just started finding like all these things. And I'm like, oh my
Yeah.
God, it makes sense now. So yes, Saint Barbara. And if you know Barbara Mordain, who does I Love Love, it's her spiritual sprays are always what I use for stuff. I don't know if y'all could
Uh-huh.
see that, but she's actually named after Saint Barbara. That's why I got pictures of the carving while we were there. I actually sent them to her. But she's associated with the tower and lightning, um, and divine inspiration, which again, when you think of the tower, that divine inspiration, it's throwing off the crown, the false king, and crumbling. Again, we talked about the sword cutting away what's false to get to
Yes.
truth. The
Yes.
tower is crumbling, it's destructing everything that is false to get to the truth. Now, this comes from Matthew 10:34, and this is supposed to be the words of Christ. Again, we're not taking any religious sides here, we're just presenting information. It says, I come not to send peace, but a sword.
Whoa.
Yeah.
My brain.
I
My brain.
I am
This is
come not to send
crazy.
peace, but a sword. Matthew 10:34. And it's,
Wow.
I mean, if you think about that, and then especially if you're a tarot reader and you associate that with the tower card, it's not about peace. It's
Yeah.
about destruction. It's about getting rid of all the things that are false in order to get to the real meat, the real heart of something.
Yeah. Whoosh.
Isn't that crazy?
Dang. Yes.
I know. I'm telling you, I went down some
Crazy.
rabbit holes.
Mind
Like
blowing.
yeah, this is, I swear, sometimes I do a lot of automatic writing because some of the stuff I'm like, okay. So,
Yeah.
and I think it goes back, I mean, it kind of goes back to what you were talking about again with that extension of the soul. Like it is our soul aching to get rid of the things that are false in
Yes.
order to make room for the things that are new. And a lot of that comes from divine inspiration, our intellect. That's what's so interesting to me when people, they don't understand. There's a lot of misconception about like psychic work. and intuition. Intuition, I say, is a gut feeling. It's a gut instinct. Like, I'm in danger. I know I need to get out of here. That's intuition. That's instinct. That's divine information that's coming in and guiding you, right? And
Right.
then with psychic work, it's more of the, I shouldn't know these things that I know. There's no way for me to have known them. This isn't just a gut instinct. I should not have these names. I should not have these dates. I should not have this, I should not be able to, tell you that your great grandmother's name was X, Y, and Z. These were her favorite things, and these are the things she wants you to know. That's mediumship, that's psychic work. But that's how it comes in. It's intellectual information. That is our conduit to the bigger picture up here. So when people see swords, I think it's important that we don't just talk about destruction and power struggles and leadership and, oh, that means, patriarchy. Because that's another thing I often hear. I don't know if you've heard, but there are people who believe that we should remove the swords and the tarot and replace them with something more pleasant,
Like
because that is a,
puppies?
I don't know.
Well, I'm sorry,
Because
what?
I don't know. Yes. Because it is a sign of patriarchy and we have to get rid of the patriarchy and blah, 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 blah.
That seems
Now,
like such a base interpretation, though, of the swords
it
and tarot,
is
because just like you're saying, the swords go so much deeper than that.
deeper.
There's a
It's not,
spiritual
yes.
tie to the sword.
Yes. And so, I mean, that's kind of my point here, is that I think it's important that we look beyond. And when we think of things like the Hebrew letter Zayin, to cut away the ignorance, the excess, to get to the heart of the meat of the matter, to get closer to divine will in alignment, whatever the hell that is for you.
Exactly.
Like, you don't have to be Christian. You don't have to be Jewish. You don't have to be Muslim. At the end of the day, there is cutting away the excess to get down to the truth and getting past things like labels or identifiers or being triggered by swords being patriarchy. Like, it's getting to the deeper truths to something, a better understanding. Where's the meat and potatoes in this? So that's my 2 cents on it.
Yeah.
Now that I've gone off on a rant, which I think I'm pretty good. Like, how many episodes are we in now? And I think this is the first rant of this is some buffoonery.
It's a good rant, though. It's because it's kind of blowing my mind. And I feel like I'm not going to look at swords cards even the same ever. Even like the whole suit of swords in the tarot, as both of us being tarot readers, I just feel like it brings a whole new level for me.
Yeah. And I think, I will tell people, if you feel inclined, you do not have to be Jewish, but I think there is a lot to be learned from learning Hebrew and its associations with, you don't have to learn Hebrew proficiently in order to be speaking it, but in order to really start seeing a lot of the symbolism in the cards and understanding where these attributes came from and why they are what they aren't. And just, again, that's that deeper layering and meaning. It's the same thing with Christianity. If you start understanding Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, whatever the case may be, we were talking about Scandinavia, we were talking about the Celts, all these different things, like understanding their beliefs and their thought processes, you start seeing these tarot cards and even just symbols out in the world, in the wild. You can say, like, yeah, I'm going to the grocery store and I look over and it catches my eye that for some reason this butcher is wielding a sword instead of a butcher knife, a cleaver. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it could just be something. And maybe he is wielding a cleaver, but your mind triggers to a sword.
Right.
You're physically seeing a cleaver, right? But that's, again, how that psychism works. You may be seeing something with your eye, but what is your mind registering that is? And that can be a, hey, time to pay attention. Definitely. So that's how it actually works. People are always like, how does it work? I'm like, that's how it actually works. Half the time what I'm seeing with my eyes is not what my brain is telling me I'm seeing.
Exactly.
But I know what I'm physically seeing and I'm discerning what I am mentally seeing are two different things. So I'm done with my tangent. That's all I got to say on my tangent about, replacing swords because we need to replace the patriarchy.
No. Just no.
Just no.
Just no.
I like that, puppies. So I expect that one of these decks that comes out, they need to have puppies in place of swords. We'll be wielding puppies in the air. Yeah, that's why a lot of them have replaced them with feathers.
I didn't know people were replacing this. How do you replace a sword.
Oh, yeah.
I do understand the sword is the element of
Air element.
air. It's the suit of the mental. I get the feather reference, but don't replace the sword itself. No.
Yeah. So a lot of them, that's where the
No.
feather inspiration is coming from, is because it is a replacement of the air element, because the sword is very much patriarchy, and we have to squash the patriarchy.
Well, we don't learn if we squash things, do we? We don't.
I
Squashing
mean,
things and making them light and feathery does not
you
necessarily
might
mean you're
you
going to
might
get
learn
deeper.
something. Yeah, I might learn something. It just may not be what you thought you were going to learn or expected to
Right.
learn. That's a
Right.
different story.
Exactly.
Well, you got anything else on the sword, Jen?
No, because my mind is buzzing and blown right now.
We got lots of unpacking to do around the tower and Jesus
Yes.
and the crown and Saint Barbara and all kinds of stuff.
I
The
got
tower card.
whole new rabbit holes to dive down
Yeah.
into.
I mean, it's interesting, especially with like the tower card, because there is no sword in it,
Right.
but there
But
is.
now I'm
There's
going to
no,
have that association when I pull that card.
yeah. So it's again that flaming sword, the descent
Yeah.
of manifestation. Well, we want to thank you guys for joining us here on Keeping It Simple. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'd love it if you dropped us some comments on our social medias. You can find us on Instagram as well as Facebook. And if we ever get it figured out, we are going to be on Threads as well. We appreciate you joining us, and we hope you have a good day. Bye, y'all.
Bye.